The first thing I remember before everything blew up was the sound of police radios muffled outside, a little boy crying somewhere down the hall, and 5 women in my living room all pointing at the same empty chair like it was a crime scene. I remember thinking weirdly that the sun looked small and mean through the window, like it had been waiting to see how all of it landed. But that was after. Before the sirens and the shouting, before the passports were found in a drawer and my life became a courtroom drama, dinner was ordinary and warm and stupidly safe. Until my aunt asked about a bakery. We were at my usual Tuesday dinner, the table cluttered with plates that no one had the heart to clear because my aunt, 91 and sharp as a tack, kept talking. She reached across for the bread and said, casual like she could have asked what the weather was, so how's that little expansion going? The bakery will need a bigger oven if it takes off, right? I put 50,000 into that for you. Her smile was proud and trusture, the kind of look that had cost her decades and a social security check or two, but never once failed to believe in people. I felt the knife of the spoon stop halfway to my mouth. There was a beat, just the clink of a fork and my heart folding in on itself. The air changed. My partner John, who had been leaning back in his chair with that easy grin that gets him out of lines at stores and into rooms he shouldn't be in, froze just a fraction too long. The muscles in his face smoothed as if he could iron the question away. Aunt Me, he said, soft and practiced, you've always been too generous. The bakery, oh, we're waiting on permits. It's coming along. I could smell garlic, but suddenly the flavor had been sucked out of everything. I kept my face neutral because my body had stopped taking commands from my mind, and I needed time to think without making a spectacle. I watched my aunt fold her hands and look at John like she was looking at an anchor, someone steady who'd promised to keep the boat upright. I watched John pull out his phone, thumbs moving fast, and for the first time really noticed the little things he always did to sell a story. Opening a fake tab of invoices, a screenshot of a contractor who didn't really exist, photos that were too perfectly staged. There was a way he answered, a rhythm of reassurance that wasn't warmth so much as a practiced performance. After she left humming about recipe cards and grandchildren, the house settled into that early night quiet where secrets usually feel safe. I didn't know what to say. I told myself to breathe and to move slowly because fast decisions were how people got hurt and I didn't want to be the one breaking anything yet. The panic was there, a rising tide in my chest that made my hands tremble, but on the outside I said calmly, can we talk in the bedroom? It felt like asking for permission to open a door to a room that might not exist. In the bedroom, away from plates and my aunt's faith, John smiled at me the way a patient smiles at a child about to misname an animal. I remember thinking with a clarity that made me both proud and ashamed that I was finally going to test him. Not with a blow-up, not with accusations in front of family. I wanted to see the lies stand on their own. Tell me about the bakery, I said, and kept my voice soft so I could measure every flinch, every pattern he couldn't hide. He told me about permits again, about a local investor, about delays, and a truck that had broken down in some town he named like it was a character in a book he was writing. There was a pause where he expected me to be reassured, and I built the rest of the night there. I told him quietly and plainly that Aunt Me had given $50,000 in good faith for that expansion, and that if we couldn't produce paperwork, contractors, anything tangible, we would need to be honest with her. He blinked, the first crack of truth showing like a hairline in glass. In that small, private moment, I decided I was going to find out everything. I promised myself I would not be the naive man who loses a mother her savings, and I promised I would confront him not with hysteria, but with the one weapon that kills every practiced liar: evidence. I told myself I was only going in for facts, that curiosity does not equal betrayal, but my hands shook through the knob when I pushed open John's office door. The room smelled like old coffee and printer toner, the kind of smell you only notice when you know you shouldn't be in a place. His laptop was asleep, the screen waiting. The filing cabinet was slightly ajar like someone had been careless. I told myself again quietly that I would be fast and clean, that I would not be the guy who tore the house apart in front of the kids. I closed the door behind me and shut out the living room quiet, the kind of quiet that assumes nothing is wrong. On his desk under neatly stacked legal pads, I found a bank envelope with my name on it but John's handwriting in the return address. My heart flipped when I slid the paper out and saw a bank statement with a deposit entry that was impossible to mistake. $50,000 described as investment MAEB. The date matched last month, right after Aunt Me's visit. I felt the room tilt. The rest of the page was worse, line after line of withdrawals, ATM cash-outs, and cashier's checks. They weren't made out to contractors or suppliers. Each cashier's check had a woman's name I didn't know and a city and a state I hadn't even heard John mention before. The checks were clean and formal, the kind you get when you want a paper trail that looks innocent until you read the memo. I rifled faster, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears. There were receipts, 2 hotel bills, restaurant tabs, and small payments to childcare with dates that tracked oddly with the trips on his company calendar. There were also cashier's checks made out to names that repeated, but with different children listed in school forms I found tucked in a drawer. At first I thought maybe these were business partners or a series of contractors. When I unfolded the school registration forms and saw different last names and different home addresses for each child, something in me went quiet and large and cold. The idea that this was a one-time mistake fell away like cheap wallpaper. Then I found the folder. It was labeled in marker projects and looked like what it wanted to be: business plans, maybe marketing mock-ups. I felt foolish for letting myself hope. Inside, every page was family, birthday photos printed on glossy paper, kids at playgrounds, group shots in front of different houses, small faces smiling into different cameras with different last names scrawled on the back. There were Polaroids dated over the last 4 years in cities that mapped a strange, looping route across the country. There were little notes in John's handwriting: "See you Sunday, Tina," and "Need to cover flight, paid cash." The kind of casual cruelty that looks handwritten and intimate until you realize it's a ledger. I sat down hard on the rolling chair and let the weight of it set into my chest. I read dates and ages and saw that these were not affairs that happened overnight. There were baby announcements, school photos with stamps from 3 separate districts, and a child's art project with a phone number on the back. It was meticulous and small and designed to be found only by someone who already knew where to look. The panic became a cold calculation. This man had walked into other people's lives pretending he was building a future with them, while he asked my elderly aunt for money and wrote her name on a bank memo as if charity and deceit could share the same signature. My hands worked on autopilot after that. I took pictures of every check, every form, every scrap, careful to capture names and dates without touching anything more than necessary. I copied files from a hidden folder on his laptop labeled projects onto a flash drive, feeling like I was stealing something that should have been mine to know. I felt sick and oddly clear-headed at the same time, horror crowded up against an odd relief that the pieces were there and could be gathered. This was not a single indiscretion. It was a pattern tied together in ledgers, receipts, and photographs that proved John had been living multiple lives for years. As I closed the office door behind me, I did not feel like the man I had been an hour earlier. The house seemed smaller, the floors thinner, like the walls knew they could not keep secrets anymore. I slid the flash drive into my pocket and rehearsed what I would say without saying it, planning steps that felt adult and legal and necessary. Somewhere in the kitchen, my phone buzzed with a text from John asking where I was. I read it with a kind of quiet fury and typed nothing back. I needed to document everything first, because the truth would not be believed on memory alone, and I had decided that if this was going to end, it would be on paper and light and proof, not on my word. I went back into the kitchen with the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket and my mouth tasting like metal. John was standing by the sink pretending to wash a pan, his back to me as if domestic chores could erase the files I had pulled from his office. I said, soft and flat because I wanted to measure him, "We need to talk. Now." He turned slowly, wiped his hands once on a dish towel, and there was no anger in his face. Only that practiced, patient look like he was about to explain a math problem to a child who asks too many questions. He did not deny anything. He sat down and with a kind of bored clarity told me everything like it was a business review and not the collapsing of 5 people's lives. "I have 5 families," he said. "I rotate through them, cash here, a plane ticket there, hush money, real names on cashier's checks, it pays for school, rent, everything. Me's 50,000 went into that pool." He explained the rotation like a travel itinerary, naming cities and saying, almost proudly, that company travel made it easy to disappear. He even pulled a paper from his back pocket and laid a printed itinerary on the table: 2 flights tomorrow, a late connection, and a return 3 days after. He told me the flight number like it was an appointment he had no interest in missing. Hearing it was like learning a part of yourself had been rented out without permission. My hands went cold and then hot. I asked questions because my head needed them lined up. "Why the fake bakery? Why me's money?" He shrugged and said, "It wasn't about the bakery. It was about convincing her we were expanding. People give money when they believe in a story." I gave her a story. There was no apology, only an efficient accounting of how he had shifted cash with ATM withdrawals and cashier's checks and labeled them as business expenses. When I tried to stop him from leaving, he smiled in a way that used to make me feel safe and instead felt like a cursor blinking on a screen. While I debated whether to call the police or to grab his passport, John moved fast. He opened a small safe, pulled out a passport, an air card, and a duffel bag and started stuffing clothes in it. He worked like a man who has rehearsed panic. My thumb grazed the zipper as if to make it harder for him to leave, and his hand closed over mine for a second. He looked at me with that practiced compassion and said, "You don't want to make this worse." Then his thumb flicked at his phone, and I watched him type as if composing a sermon. He hit send on 5 messages in quick succession, and the phone buzzed on the counter like a beehive. He had sent the same link and the same lie to each woman he was hiding from, a message that painted me as the devil in the story. "He controlled me," one text said. "He'll gaslight you. He wants to ruin us." Each note was crafted to make them hate me first, to funnel their anger away from him. I watched the blue bubbles move across the screen, then he deleted the outgoing message so it could not be easily traced to him. He walked out the door with his duffel and a passport, and a look that said he had already moved on. Within minutes, we heard car doors slam on the street like a drum roll. I opened the front door and saw headlights on the curb and women 4, then 5, and children in the back seats. They were calling his name and asking where he was, their voices combining into something raw and jagged that cut the afternoon like a saw. They weren't organized, they were not a conspiracy. They were hurt, confused, and furious, and some of them were clearly carrying the kind of fear that comes from sleeping one hand over a child's face at night. They streamed up my walkway and into my living room like they had been summoned not by me, but by his need to be rescued by the chaos he created. One woman grabbed my arm and cried that he had told her I'd been violent, that I had stolen money. Another pushed past and demanded to see his things. A toddler cried and hid behind her mother's knees. They all looked at me the way people look at a suspect on TV, certain before evidence, certain because someone else had painted the picture for them. I tried to show them the flash drive, the prints of cashier's checks, the photo folders, but their faces were already made up with betrayal and accusation. Neighbors started to gather, and a neighbor called the police because yelling in the block invites intervention. In that moment, I felt both like the center of an accusation and the only person with the receipts to prove otherwise. I stood there in the middle of the storm he left behind, my pockets full of paper and pixels, and I promised myself 2 things. I would not let him rewrite the story, and I would not let the women who had been duped become pawns in his escape. The house was full of noise and questions, and I leaned against the counter and told everyone to stop and listen, because this mess was going to need more than anger. It needed proof, and I had it. They poured onto my porch like a flood I had been warned about but never pictured. 5 women, 3 strollers, 2 car seats, and 4 toddlers yelping like tiny alarms. One woman pushed through the screen, hair tangled, voice raw as she said my partner's name like it was a curse. Another held a baby to her chest and kept asking, "Where is he? Where is he?" as if my house might cough him up. They demanded answers in a dozen different ways, some fierce, some pleading, all exhausted. I felt caught between their fury and my own white-hot panic, and knew I had to act fast to keep whatever proof I had from dissolving in the chaos. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and locked every latch like a man sealing a time capsule of truth. My hands were clumsy but purposeful as I ripped open the folders I'd tucked under the sink the week before. I pulled out the bank statement showing Aunt Me's deposit, the cashier's checks with names and cities, the hotel receipts, and the school forms. I grabbed the flash drive and the folder of glossy photos. While the women shouted on my porch, I laid everything on the kitchen table in a neat, awful row. I told myself I had to be methodical because hysteria would only hand them the story John wanted them to believe. When one of the mothers pushed the door partly open and cried that he had called her a liar, I pushed it closed gently and shouted, "Please, let me show you something." A neighbor I barely knew was on his front steps with a phone pointed straight at us, recording with his jacket collar pulled up like it was a game. He said between breaths, "People are sharing this already," and held the screen up so I could see the blue bubbles of a live stream. Someone across the street had already started to pull into like they were arriving to a neighborhood event. I could feel reputation and rumor building wings above us. The sound of sirens cut through just as I dialed 911, my voice steady despite the shake. I told the dispatcher we needed help, that there were multiple women here looking for the man who had been using them, and that I had documents proving a fraud. The dispatcher promised police were on the way and told me to keep everyone calm, which felt almost impossible with a toddler screaming and a woman slapping her palms against the door. The police arrived with lights and a soft authority that the crowd suddenly recognized, and an officer with a tired face began moving people apart like she was clearing chess pieces from a board. She asked everyone to sit on the lawn. She separated the mothers into a line and took down names while another officer guided me back inside to look at the documents. I watched faces, anger, disbelief, fear, arranged like a chorus meant to shame a person who was already gone. When the officer asked me to hand over the flash drive and the cashier's checks, my fingers trembled, but I obeyed. I gave them copies of everything, told them where I'd found the passport, described the flight itinerary I had seen, and pointed out the dates that matched hotel receipts. A younger officer listened like someone reading a plot twist in a book he didn't want to like. They took statements one by one under a maple tree that had become, for a few terrible hours, a public tribunal. The neighbor handed his phone to an officer, and the officer said he would store the recording as evidence. A detective on his way over called to say this had potential beyond a married quarrel and might be criminal in several states. The women talked in low, fierce clusters, naming cities and dates and children the way people read an epidemic report aloud. I kept thinking of Aunt Me folding her hands at the table, proud and trusting, and felt a hot, stupid guilt for not seeing what I should have sooner. The street filled with curious faces and whispered judgments, and I realized my private life had become a show for everyone to watch and choose sides in. Standing there with my name and his lies now on paper in an evidence bag, I felt both humiliated and oddly resolute. Public spectacle had met private betrayal, and neither felt tidy. I was scared for the women on my porch and for the kids who had no idea their lives were part of a map I'd only just found. I also felt the small, fierce shape of a plan forming inside me. Gather everything, protect the vulnerable, and make sure the truth could not be silenced by charm or a passport. The police were taking statements, cameras were clicking, and a dozen neighbors had opinions. I held onto the documents like a small, heavy hope that we could turn furious noise into real, slow justice. The first meeting with a lawyer felt like walking into a courtroom before anything had happened, fluorescent lights and the smell of cheap coffee filling the air. I sat across from a woman who had clearly seen this before, her hands folded, and I handed her a fat manila envelope full of prints and screenshots and hotel receipts that still smelled faintly of tobacco. She said the word elder financial abuse like it was a blunt instrument and not a shameful secret. We talked divorce and criminal referrals in the same breath, because in cases like this, the civil and criminal paths run together, and the only language the system used was paperwork. We filed for an emergency restraining order that afternoon because he had a passport and a head start, and because men like him count on time being on their side. The court clerk moved fast. The judge signed a temporary order that forbade him from contacting any of us and required him to surrender passports if found. The restraining order felt like a thin wall, but it was a wall I could point to when the women arrived at my house or when Aunt Me called trembling. The order bought us a sliver of safety so we could breathe and plan, and I learned quickly that safety is negotiated in forms, not promises. I opened a police case for fraud, for conspiracy, and for elder abuse, and I handed over the flash drive and the neighbor's video as if they were weapons. The detective who took my statement had a notebook full of colleagues' names and a voice that suggested a long list of similar stories. He explained subpoenas and warrants in plain words and told me they would try to pull ATM footage from the banks, get phone records, trace cashiers' check endorsements, and follow the money. He also said the case would probably touch multiple jurisdictions, and that meant more paperwork and more waiting. But real investigators were now on it. We worked with a prosecutor's office liaison to file elder abuse reports with Social Security and with the state agency that protects elders, because Aunt Me's $50,000 was not just a line item. It was a theft that punished a woman who trusted us twice over. The banks placed temporary holds on the joint accounts after I furnished them with copies of the checks and withdrawals, and they opened fraud investigations. They put a freeze on new credit, but not fast enough. I found out the hard way that John had systematically opened credit accounts in my name and taken out personal loans I knew nothing about. Seeing my own name tied to unknown debts felt like watching a stranger forge my signature across my life. Detectives pulled camera footage and sent it to forensics teams. They subpoenaed the hotel chains for guest logs and matched them to the card numbers on the receipts. They found ATM cameras where cashier's checks had been cashed and saw his back turned to the camera, hood up, the posture of someone trying to disappear while money moved out of sight. The bank identified payments made to mail forwarding services, and one suspicious account was under a name I had never heard but linked to the same Social Security digit pattern as a page of forms I found in his projects folder. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was a breadcrumb trail across states. It hurt in practical ways, too. I sold a guitar and an old motorcycle to make rent and to pay retainer fees a little faster, small humiliations that made the justice feel expensive. But the lawyers wrote motions to freeze his remaining assets and to get emergency access to some money so Aunt Me could use what she needed without fear. We placed fraud alerts with the credit bureaus and filed identity theft affidavits. The women pooled what they had and shared bank statements and school forms so detectives could build a timeline. It was ugly, it was exhausting, But it was a necessary march through paper and courtrooms towards something I dared to call accountability. Trust had been weaponized against us, so now the law and a lot of paperwork would have to be the blunt force we used to take it back. We started with a group chat that felt half like therapy and half like an evidence locker. Women I barely knew and I texting in a tight, burning thread that moved faster than any thought. At first it was receipts and photos, the small things that prove a life. Screenshots of messages, hotel confirmation numbers, pictures of children with the same man in different cities, and bank deposit slips that lined up with his travel dates. They wrote in all caps sometimes, they cried in voice notes sometimes, and they sent each other maps they'd made with pins showing where he'd been the last 3 years. I watched a messy, angry map come together and felt equal parts horror and relief because the pattern could no longer be explained away as coincidence. I uploaded the bank statements I had taken from his office and typed a short, ugly message. "This is where Aunt Me's 50,000 went." The chat erupted. Women who'd been told they were crazy suddenly had a paper path to point to. One of them made a spreadsheet in hours, columns for date, city, hotel, childcare note, and a link to photos. Another volunteered to contact a child support office in her state and posted a template for affidavits so no one had to write one from scratch. Someone else found a lawyer who did pro bono work for custody cases and pasted his email into the thread. Out of anger and necessity, we had become efficient. Built a schedule from the crumbs. Flight numbers matched hotel receipts which matched school absence notes with dates that lined up too neatly to be innocent. I remember typing, he rotated like clockwork, and watching the word go from abstract pain to a chart with colors. We could see a rhythm: Midwest weekend, Southeast week, West Coast month. That rotation explained the empty chair and the fake business pitch. It also explained how he paid hush money without leaving a trail that looked like a paycheck. The mothers used the map to file child support claims in their respective counties, and I sent notarized copies of the cashier's checks and my aunt's deposit to prosecutors and support enforcement agencies. We did things the system should have done faster. We pooled small amounts to hire an investigator for a few hours, and she dug into shell accounts and mail forwards. We shared templates for civil suits so anyone could file a fraud claim with clear language. We used one lawyer's pro bono clinic for initial fillings and coordinated referrals across state lines. Someone set up a shared folder where we dropped evidence, and if you wanted to sleep at night, you could at least close your eyes knowing a legal checklist was on the other side of the screen. It felt like jury duty with our lives on trial, except this jury wrote motions and gave each other rides to court. There were ugly practicalities. We withdrew money to pay retainers and set up a fundraiser that embarrassed half of us but kept the lawyers calling. We arranged vetting for emergency childcare so mothers could go to hearings without dragging small children into an attorney's office. We traded resources. One woman had an accountant, another had an old friend at the prosecutor's office who would take a look at the cashier's checks. Emotional labor became a currency. Someone would check in at night, "How are you holding up?" while another would say, "Post the hotel receipts here and I'll annotate them." That code of small kindnesses turned raw grief into forward motion. There were moments of ugly truth in the thread. Accusations flared, old jealousies surfaced, and one message blamed me for not seeing it earlier. I answered honestly, "I failed Aunt Me, I'm fixing it." We argued because pain makes people sharp, but every argument ended with someone posting a photo of a child and the words, "This is why we keep going." We decided together to push for criminal charges in every state where we had evidence and to file civil suits for fraud and damages. We were driven by the small, stubborn idea that this man would not be allowed to build families like houses and move on. As the legal wheels started turning, our chat held steady and began to feel hopeful in a practical way. We didn't just want revenge. We wanted accountability, child support, and the records fixed so the kids had benefits and health insurance. We wanted Aunt Me's money returned or repaid and a criminal record that would stop him from repeating the pattern. The coalition outlived court dates. We became a messy, honest group that texted each other recipes and legal updates, shared childcare, and laughed at dumb jokes when things got too heavy. What began as 5 wounded mothers and 1 stunned man turned into a grassroots legal team, and if I allow myself to say it, a new kind of family. One built on truth, not charm, and on the hard work of rebuilding what was stolen. The court hall smelled like disinfectant and old paint, and I learned to pace my breathing before I walked into each small room. I sat through hearings for restraining orders that felt like paper walls around grief, and I sat through magistrate dockets where judges moved like metronomes and stamped our chaos into official time. Every appearance meant ferrying paperwork from state to state, explaining to strangers why 5 women had come together, and watching lawyers in different jurisdictions argue over who had priority. It was exhausting and humiliating, but every stamped form felt like a tiny victory against a man who loved to hide behind smooth words. Coordinating prosecutors was like trying to herd cats across state lines. Emails bounced, phone trees failed, and jurisdictions guarded their caseloads like small kingdoms. One prosecutor in a Midwestern county wanted to wait for our state to finish its investigation. Another said evidence had to be duplicated and authenticated before they would open a file. I lost time explaining basic facts over and over while child support clocks ticked and money vanished. The slow pace of justice was almost its own cruelty. Weeks of waiting meant bills piled up, collectors called, and anxiety became a second job. I learned that the legal system values paperwork more than urgency. We filed child support petitions in 3 different states and asked for emergency wage garnishments where his employment could be verified. The first successful garnishment was a strange relief, a notice that his paycheck would now send a slice directly to one of the mothers for rent and daycare. I felt light for a day and then heavy again, because the garnishment did not erase the months of missed payments or the debt collectors calling about loans I never took out. I had to file identity theft affidavits and sit on hold for bank fraud departments, while the coalition juggled childcare and deposit slips like a jury of exhausted parents. The forged credit lines were a particular kind of ugliness that followed me in quiet ways. I kept getting letters that named accounts I didn't recognize and a single line on a credit report that pulled down my score like an anchor. Every time I called, I gave patience and proof and waited for an apology that never came. I had already sold a guitar and a motorcycle and swallowed the shame that came with it, but the forged debts lingered like a shadow, reminding me that some damages are slow and administrative and not exciting enough for headlines. That slow damage cost nights of sleep and made every loan application feel like a referendum on my life. There were small legal wins that tasted half sweet and half raw. A judge extended the restraining order after seeing the evidence we compiled, which felt like someone finally believing the story we had lived. A court granted an emergency asset freeze on several accounts after prosecutors showed cashier's checks and travel logs, which bought Aunt Me breathing room and stopped a few planned transfers. The women got temporary custody adjustments to secure school enrollments and health coverage. Each win was a patch, not a cure, and I learned to celebrate them in private so the public part of me wouldn't seem triumphal where there was still so much damage. Then, in a way that felt cinematic and plain at once, an officer on a routine traffic stop in another state pulled over a car John was driving and ran his plates, which flagged a warrant. He was arrested not heroically but through a traffic infraction and some slow police work, and when the call came through to our detective, a strange part of me laughed and another part felt hollow. The arrest made headlines in small local feeds, and the women cried and hugged in a courthouse hallway, but it also proved how petty and how human his fall was. The spectacle of him in handcuffs did not fix Aunt Me's $50,000 nor remove the forged loans from my name, but it did force him into a system that could finally start to tie a legal knot around his lies. We kept hammering at civil suits for fraud while criminal charges moved state by state, and the logistics felt like running a relay race where the baton kept falling. Some judges ordered payments, some prosecutors declined charges, and through it all the coalition adapted, sending subpoenas and witness lists and paying court fees from a shared account. The legal marathon wore on. It took time, patience, and money we didn't have, but it also taught me that justice is not a single verdict. It is 1,000 small, stubborn papers that say you belong to the truth. Bittersweet victories stacked up slowly, and amid the exhaustion I started to believe that the rebuilding we'd begged for was, at least, possible. The first week after the last hearing felt like a slow exhale that might never end, but life demanded small, ugly chores and I did them because there was no other choice. A friend from work, Mark, showed up with a van and 2 strong arms and told me, "You can crash at my place for a month, man. We'll get you back on your feet." I took him up on it, packed what I could, and moved into a modest rental that smelled like old paint and new starts. It was tiny and honest, and for the first time in months I slept without checking every noise. I sold the rest of what I owned that had value, my amp, a favorite watch, things that had been tied to happier memories so the money could go to lawyers and to keep lights on. Each sale felt like a small burial and a strange paycheck. When the buyer handed me cash for the motorcycle, I said, "This is for paying someone back what he stole," and the man nodded like he understood more than I expected. At work, my supervisor pulled me aside and offered me a steady promotion with more hours and less travel, which I accepted because stability mattered more than pride. "We need you here," she said, and I took the job like a rope thrown to someone still learning to swim. Aunt Me started going to a community support group for elders after I drove her to the first meeting and sat in the back while she talked, tentative at first and then with more fire as the weeks went on. She learned that shame is a club meant to isolate and that telling strangers your story sometimes strips shame of its power. She began making small plans, fixing a sagging recipe book, volunteering at a food bank, and the color came back to her hands. Watching her laugh at a bad joke in a church basement felt like a miracle after the hollow months, where trust had been a ledger of losses. The mothers in the chat renamed it the Coalition and set rules. No more angry midnight messages, share receipts only in the evidence folder, and check in for real when someone had a court date. They started a calendar of custody hearings and an emergency fund that paid for daycare during long legal sessions. When one of the women finally saw enforced child support hit her bank, she sent a voice note that made everyone cry at once. "It's not everything," she said, voice shaking, "but it's something real." Those small, enforceable payments felt like more than money. They were a legal recognition of responsibility. We also did things that felt like reclaiming life instead of only chasing justice. We helped a local woman open a little legit bakery using donations from neighbors and a small microloan arranged through the coalition, and she used Aunt Me's old recipes and a sign that said "Open, Honest Bread." Watching a real oven heat up and people line up felt like a form of reparations I could touch. The coalition celebrated by showing up on Saturdays to fold dough, cover shifts, and teach kids how to frost cupcakes without making a mess we couldn't fix. There were still legal annoyances. I fought to clear my credit report line by line and watched as some settlements landed like drops on a hot plate, relief and heat at the same time. John's criminal case moved slowly but inevitably, and watching him lose the charm that had carried him across state lines felt like watching smoke finally meet wind. Some people thought I should forgive and move on faster, others said I was too cautious. I believed both could be true. Forgiveness is a personal choice, and accountability is something the law decides. Now, months later, the world looks different but not empty of risk. I have a steady job, a small apartment with a plant that gets watered, and a group of friends who know all my paperwork. The coalition is still active, checking on court dates and birthdays and sharing recipes and jokes. Aunt Me calls every Sunday and tells me about a new friend at her group. We rebuilt not because justice was quick or whole, but because a messy, stubborn community showed up and stayed. If there is a lesson, it's ugly and plain. Charm can be a weapon, institutions can be slow, and legal battles are exhausting, but resilience grows where people refuse to be lonely in their pain. The road from betrayal to rebuilding is long, full of small steps and harder truths, but I can see it now, paved by others who chose to walk with me.